Chosen one, listen carefully. This message isn't an accident. God is preparing something you never saw coming. Chosen one, listen carefully, because sometimes the greatest obstacle standing between two people is not distance, timing, or even circumstance. Sometimes it is a voice that tells someone what to believe about you before they ever give themselves the opportunity to discover who you really are. And that is where this becomes psychologically fascinating. Human beings rarely make decisions based only on facts. We make decisions through stories. Someone tells us, be careful with that person. Someone says, I know what they're really like. Someone describes an experience, adds an interpretation, and suddenly their interpretation becomes our reality. We begin responding to a person we have never truly understood, based on information filtered through someone else's emotions. That is how influence works. Your soulmate may have heard something about you that created doubt before genuine understanding had a chance to develop. Maybe someone warned them that you would hurt them. Maybe they were told that you were not trustworthy, that you were too complicated, that you were not ready, or that getting close to you would only lead to disappointment. But here is the question most people never stop to ask. Why was that person so determined to make them stay away? Because concern and control do not look the same when you examine their deeper motives. A person who genuinely cares about someone may offer a warning, but they will still leave room for that person to think, observe, and decide. Manipulation operates differently. Manipulation does not simply provide information, it attempts to control the conclusion. And sometimes jealousy hides behind concern. Sometimes insecurity disguises itself as wisdom. Sometimes a person who feels threatened by your connection will create a narrative that makes separation seem reasonable. Think about how powerful that is. If I can convince you of something before you experience it yourself, I don't have to control your actions directly. I only have to influence the meaning you assign to those actions. This is why you must become careful about whose voice you allow to define your identity. You cannot build your life around every opinion people have about you. If someone misunderstood you yesterday, that misunderstanding does not become your identity today. If someone has judged your past, that judgment does not automatically determine your future. And the same principle applies to relationships. Your soulmate may have been influenced by someone else's fear, disappointment, jealousy, or personal history. They may have believed the warning because they trusted the person delivering it. And when we trust the messenger, we often stop questioning the message. But truth has an interesting quality. It does not need constant promotion. A false story usually requires repetition. It needs reinforcement. It needs people to keep talking about it because silence gives reality an opportunity to challenge it. Truth, on the other hand, reveals itself through experience. Eventually, your soulmate may have begun noticing things that didn't match the story they were given. Perhaps your actions contradicted the accusations. Perhaps your character did not resemble the description. Perhaps the person they were warned about turned out to be more compassionate, more intentional, or more genuine than they expected. And that creates an internal conflict. Psychology calls this cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that appears when what we believed conflicts with what we are experiencing. Suddenly, they have a choice. Do they protect the story they were told, or do they investigate the truth for themselves? That decision can change everything. And maybe that is the deeper lesson for you as well. Stop exhausting yourself trying to convince everyone who misunderstood you. Stop chasing people who only know you through someone else's narrative. Let your character speak through consistency. Let your actions become evidence. Let time expose what words tried to hide. Because when someone truly wants to know you, they will eventually look beyond the warning and ask the most important question: what is the truth for myself? And when they do, the story others created about you may finally begin to collapse. Never fight to control the narrative. Live so truth eventually speaks for itself. And once your soulmate began questioning the warning, something deeper started happening. They were no longer simply deciding whether to come closer to you or stay away. They were beginning to confront the difference between what they had been told and what was actually true. Because sometimes the most powerful barrier between two people is not reality, It is a story. Someone may have told your soulmate something about your character, your past, your intentions, or your ability to love. And when a story is delivered with confidence, emotion, and enough detail, the human mind naturally begins filling in the missing pieces. We create an image of a person before we have actually experienced that person. That is the danger of second-hand truth. You can hear one person's interpretation of another human being and mistake it for objective reality. You can inherit somebody else's disappointment and call it wisdom. You can inherit somebody else's fear and call it intuition. But there is a fundamental principle of human psychology. Information is not the same thing as truth. Information can be incomplete. It can be exaggerated. It can be emotionally distorted. It can even be technically accurate while still creating a completely misleading impression. Imagine someone tells your soulmate that person is distant. Perhaps you are actually protecting yourself after being hurt. Someone says, they don't care. Perhaps you were struggling privately and didn't know how to express what you felt. Someone says, they will never commit. Perhaps you had simply learned to stop making promises you weren't prepared to keep. Do you see the difference? The behavior may have been real, but the interpretation may have been wrong. And this is where mature thinking begins. Mature people don't simply ask, what happened? They ask, why did it happen? What context am I missing? Who is telling me this? And what might they gain from me believing it? That final question can completely change your understanding of a situation, because every story has a storyteller, and every storyteller has a perspective. Your soulmate may eventually discover that the person who warned them was not necessarily lying about everything. They may have simply been presenting the truth through their own emotional lens. Maybe they were hurt by you. Maybe they misunderstood you. Maybe they compared you to someone from their past. Maybe they were afraid of losing their influence. And sometimes the most dangerous deception is not a complete lie. It is a partial truth arranged in a way that produces a false conclusion. That is why you should never judge an entire person by a single chapter of their life. You have made mistakes. So has everyone listening to this. You have had moments when you were afraid, confused, emotionally unavailable, defensive, or simply immature. But one difficult season does not tell the complete story of a human being. Your soulmate may have been given the chapter where you struggled while never being shown the chapter where you grew. They may have heard about your failures without hearing about the lessons those failures produced. They may have been told what you did without ever being told what you learned. And eventually, reality has a way of asking better questions. What happens when the person they were told to fear turns out to be the person who understands them most deeply? What happens when the person described as cold becomes the person whose presence feels safe? What happens when the warnings begin contradicting their own experience? That is when the truth begins coming out, not because you forced it, but because reality became stronger than the narrative. And this is an important lesson for you. Do not spend your life desperately trying to correct every misunderstanding. Your responsibility is not to manage everyone's perception of you. Your responsibility is to become the kind of person whose consistent character eventually makes false narratives impossible to sustain. Let your actions speak longer than rumors. Let your growth speak louder than your past. Let your character become the evidence. Because when someone finally discovers the truth for themselves, they don't just change their opinion of you. They also realize how easily they allowed someone else's perspective to become their own. And that realization can become the beginning of something completely different. The truth does not need permission to emerge. It only needs time to be seen. And this is where the story takes a deeper turn, because sometimes the distance between two people is not evidence that the connection was meaningless. Sometimes distance reveals what closeness was hiding. When your soulmate pulled away, perhaps you immediately interpreted it as rejection. Maybe you wondered what you had done wrong. Maybe you replayed every conversation, every message, every moment of silence, trying to discover where everything changed. But human beings have a tendency to personalize uncertainty. When we don't know why someone leaves, we often create an explanation, and unfortunately, the explanation is frequently, "There must be something wrong with me." But what if that wasn't the truth? What if the distance was created by information they had received rather than by something they had personally experienced? What if they were trying to protect themselves from a danger that didn't actually exist? And what if that separation gave both of you something that constant closeness could never provide? Perspective. There is a powerful psychological principle at work here. When people are emotionally close to a situation, their judgment can become clouded by fear, attachment, expectation, and pressure. Distance can create space for observation. It allows a person to step outside the emotional intensity and ask, what do I actually believe? What do I actually feel? What evidence do I really have? That question can change everything. Your soulmate may have initially accepted the warning because it gave them certainty. Certainty feels safe, even when it is wrong. If someone tells you, stay away from this person because they will hurt you, suddenly you have a simple explanation for a complicated situation. But life rarely works in simple explanations. Maybe they stayed away. Maybe they stopped communicating. Maybe they became colder. Maybe they convinced themselves that walking away was the mature thing to do. And perhaps you were left wondering why something that felt meaningful suddenly became so difficult. But here's what you must understand. Not every closed door is a final answer. Sometimes a closed door is a period of examination. It forces you to stop chasing. It forces the other person to stop relying on outside opinions. It forces both people to confront what remains when the emotional noise becomes quiet. And silence can reveal things that conversation sometimes hides. When someone no longer has constant access to you, they begin remembering the details they overlooked. They remember how you made them feel. They remember conversations. They remember moments when your actions didn't match the negative image they had been given. Memory begins competing with the narrative. Experience begins challenging assumption. And slowly, the question changes from, why should I stay away, to, why was I told to stay away in the first place? That is a profound shift, because once someone starts questioning the source of the warning, they begin examining the motive behind it. Was that person genuinely concerned? Were they projecting their own experiences? Were they afraid of losing influence? Were they jealous? Or were they simply repeating something they themselves had misunderstood? You don't always get to control what happens during that process. And that's one of the hardest lessons. You cannot force someone to see what they are not ready to see. You cannot argue another person into emotional clarity. You cannot convince someone to trust you if their mind has already been programmed to interpret everything you do through suspicion. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step back and allow reality to work. Not passively, not bitterly, not with resentment, but with dignity. You continue becoming healthier, you continue growing, you continue strengthening your character, you continue living according to your values, rather than trying to prove your worth to someone who has temporarily misunderstood you. Because if a connection is real, it should eventually be able to survive examination. And if it cannot survive truth, then perhaps what you were holding on to was not the connection itself, but the idea of what you wanted it to become. That distinction requires courage. Sometimes God allows distance not because He is destroying something, but because distance exposes what was built on fear and what was built on truth. So don't automatically interpret silence as the end. Don't automatically interpret distance as rejection. And don't automatically assume that someone's withdrawal means you were not enough. Sometimes people walk away because they are confused. Sometimes they walk away because they are afraid. Sometimes they walk away because they are listening to the wrong voice. And sometimes that distance becomes the very thing that gives them the clarity to finally hear their own heart. Never fear a season of distance. Sometimes clarity needs space before truth can be recognized. And then something begins to change. Not dramatically at first, not with some grand announcement or undeniable revelation. It often begins with small contradictions, little moments that don't fit the story your soulmate was given. They notice something, then they notice something else. Maybe they hear your name in a conversation and realize the description they've been carrying doesn't match what they've personally witnessed. Maybe they remember something you said months ago and suddenly understand what you actually meant. Maybe someone tells them another version of the story, and for the first time, they recognize that the truth has more than one side. This is how false narratives often begin to collapse. Not all at once, piece by piece, because the human mind has a remarkable ability to defend what it already believes. Once we accept a story, we tend to search for evidence that confirms it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. We notice what supports our assumptions and overlook what challenges them. So if your soulmate was told that you were selfish, they might interpret your silence as selfishness. If they were told you were emotionally distant, they might interpret your need for space as rejection. If they were told you couldn't be trusted, even an innocent mistake might appear suspicious. The same behavior can look completely different depending on the story someone already believes about you. But eventually, confirmation bias can work in the opposite direction. Your soulmate begins seeing evidence that contradicts the narrative. They remember that you showed compassion when you had nothing to gain. They remember that you respected boundaries instead of crossing them. They remember that you didn't retaliate when you could have. They remember that you kept your word in situations where nobody would have known if you didn't. And suddenly, the image they were given starts developing cracks. This is where truth becomes powerful. Truth doesn't always arrive through dramatic revelation. Sometimes it arrives through consistency. A person can pretend for a day. They can perform for a week. They can manipulate a conversation. But character is difficult to fake indefinitely. Eventually, patterns reveal what isolated moments conceal. And your soulmate may begin comparing the person they were warned about with the person they actually experienced. That comparison can be uncomfortable, because now they have to confront something deeper than whether you are trustworthy. They have to confront whether they allowed somebody else to make a decision for them, and that can produce an emotional conflict that has nothing to do with you. They may feel embarrassed, they may feel guilty, they may feel angry at themselves for believing something without investigating it. They may even become defensive because accepting the truth means admitting that they were wrong. And human beings do not always enjoy admitting they were wrong. But maturity begins where defensiveness ends. At some point, a person has to say, maybe I didn't have the whole story. Those 6 words can change a relationship. Because the moment someone becomes willing to question their assumptions, they become capable of seeing you as a human being rather than as a character in someone else's story. And that is what you should want, not blind loyalty, not someone who believes everything you say, not someone who ignores your mistakes. You want someone capable of seeing reality clearly enough to distinguish between your flaws and the false accusations attached to them. Because genuine love is not built on perfect images, it is built on truthful understanding. Your soulmate doesn't need to discover that you are flawless, they need to discover that you are real. They need to see your strengths, your weaknesses, your history, your growth, your mistakes and your intentions, and still be capable of making their own informed decision. That is far more meaningful than being loved because someone created an idealized version of you. And perhaps this is why the truth had to come out gradually, because if everything were revealed instantly, the lesson might be forgotten just as quickly. But when someone watches the contradictions accumulate, when they personally witness the difference between rumor and reality, the realization becomes permanent. They begin to understand that the warning wasn't necessarily a window into your character. It may have been a window into someone else's character, and once they recognize that distinction, the entire situation looks different. So don't panic when the truth seems slow. Don't assume that because someone doesn't understand you today, they never will. Keep your integrity, keep your peace, keep becoming the person you know you are called to become, because eventually consistency has a way of becoming undeniable. When the story and reality collide, reality wins, and your character becomes the evidence. And now we reach the moment where the entire situation begins to reveal its deeper meaning. Because once your soulmate starts seeing the contradictions, they are forced to examine not only what they were told about you, but who was telling them, and why. This is where the difference between protection and control becomes impossible to ignore. Real protection gives someone information and allows them to make their own decision. Control gives someone information and then pressures them toward a predetermined conclusion. There is a profound psychological difference between the two. If I genuinely care about you, I can say, "Here is what I know, be careful, think about it, make your own decision." But if I need to control you, I say, "You must stay away, don't question me, don't talk to them, don't give them another chance, trust me." Notice the difference. One respects your intelligence, the other depends on your dependence. And perhaps your soulmate eventually began recognizing this difference. Maybe the person who warned them kept adding new reasons why they shouldn't trust you. Every time your soulmate questioned the warning, another explanation appeared. Every time evidence contradicted the story had to be expanded to protect itself. That is often how manipulation survives. It doesn't necessarily survive because it is convincing. It survives because it keeps moving the goalpost. And eventually an intelligent person begins asking, "Why am I being told what I must believe?" That question is dangerous to manipulation, because once people start thinking independently, control begins losing its power. Your soulmate may have realized that genuine concern does not require isolation. Genuine concern does not demand secrecy. Genuine concern does not become angry simply because someone asks questions. And this is an important lesson far beyond relationships. You must become careful about people who confuse their fear with your destiny. Someone can sincerely believe they are helping you and still be wrong. Someone can love you and still project their unresolved pain onto your choices. Someone can have good intentions and still give terrible advice. So wisdom requires more than listening. It requires discernment. Discernment asks, is this person helping me see more clearly, or are they helping me become more afraid? That question can expose a great deal, because fear narrows your world. Truth expands it. Fear says, don't investigate. Truth says, look carefully. Fear says, you already know enough. Wisdom says, make sure you understand. And perhaps your soulmate eventually chose wisdom. Maybe they began looking at you without the filter someone else had placed over their eyes. They may have discovered that you were not perfect, but you were not the person they had been warned about either. And that realization can be humbling, because now they must acknowledge that they allowed another person's perspective to influence something deeply personal. But don't misunderstand this moment. The goal isn't revenge. You don't need your soulmate to hate the person who interfered. You don't need them to expose that person publicly. You don't need a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply clarity. When someone finally understands what happened, they no longer have to live according to someone else's fear. They can make their own decision, and that is where a healthy connection begins. Not with pressure, not with obsession, not with manipulation, but with freedom. If your soulmate chooses to come closer after discovering the truth, let that decision belong to them. If they choose to rebuild trust, let it happen through consistency. If they need time, respect the process. Because love that requires control is not freedom, and love that survives freedom is much stronger. Perhaps this entire experience is teaching you something as well. Stop trying to force people to choose you. Stop trying to prove yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Your responsibility is to live with enough integrity that the people who genuinely want to know you have something real to discover. You don't need to control the outcome. You need to control your character. You need to control your choices. You need to control the way you respond when misunderstood. And if the truth eventually brings two people back toward each other, let that reunion be built on something stronger than emotion. Let it be built on honesty. Let it be built on discernment. Let it be built on freedom. Because when someone stops following another person's fear and finally begins following truth, the relationship is no longer being directed by an outsider. It is finally being decided by the people who actually have to live with the consequences. Real love does not demand control. It survives when both people are finally free to choose the truth.